"Watch her," the store manager said quietly from the second-floor balcony, and the moment those words left his mouth, Naomi Carter felt every eye in the luxury department slide toward her like cold steel. The department store glowed with soft gold lighting and crystal chandeliers hanging nearly 20 feet above the marble floor, but none of that warmth touched her skin. She stood near the entrance holding the strap of her faded gray tote bag, while snow melted slowly from the sleeves of her dark blue hospital hoodie. Her feet ached inside worn nursing shoes after a 14-hour overnight shift at St. Vincent Medical Center, and the sharp smell of expensive perfume floating through the air mixed strangely with the lingering scent of antiseptic still trapped in her clothes. Around her, wealthy guests laughed softly while sipping champagne from thin crystal glasses as violin music drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked among women wrapped in designer coats worth more than 3 months of her rent. But she had not come there for herself. In her pocket sat a folded note with her mother's glove size written in shaky handwriting. Her mother had recently lost feeling in 2 fingers after chemotherapy treatments, and Naomi had promised she would find something warm before the first real winter storm hit Chicago. She walked slowly toward a display table lined with cashmere gloves beneath white spotlights, so bright they made the silver price tag shine like mirrors. $380. Naomi swallowed hard at the number and gently touched the fabric anyway, rubbing it carefully between her fingers like someone afraid to damage something beautiful. Above her, Richard Holloway watched from the balcony with his hands folded behind his back. His tailored black suit fit perfectly against his tall frame, and the polished silver watch on his wrist flashed each time he moved beneath the lights. To the guests around him, he wore the calm smile of a professional manager hosting an elegant private event. But when his eyes landed on Naomi again, that smile tightened almost invisibly. "She doesn't belong here tonight," he muttered to the young security guard beside him. The guard hesitated. "Sir, she hasn't done anything." Richard's jaw shifted slightly. "I said watch her." Downstairs, Naomi picked up a pair of dark brown gloves and checked the tag one more time. Her fingers trembled from exhaustion more than fear, but she still smiled faintly, imagining her mother opening the gift. Then she heard footsteps approaching across the marble floor behind her. Slow, intentional. The music suddenly seemed quieter. Conversations nearby faded one by one as people noticed the security guard walking directly toward her. Naomi turned carefully, her heartbeat quickening when she saw 2 employees staring at her from behind the perfume counter. The young guard stopped only a few feet away. "Ma'am," he said softly, clearly uncomfortable, "the manager would like to speak with you." Naomi blinked in confusion. About what? Before he could answer, Richard Holloway descended the staircase above them with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking sharply against each marble stair while dozens of wealthy guests watched in silence. He stopped directly in front of Naomi, glanced once at the gloves in her hand, then looked her up and down slowly before asking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Can you actually afford those?" For a few long seconds, Naomi could not hear anything except the soft buzz of the chandelier lights above her head and the faint hum of the heating vents pushing warm air through the luxury department store. Richard Holloway stood perfectly still in front of her with one hand resting inside the pocket of his tailored coat, while the other pointed casually toward the gloves she held against her chest. Around them, wealthy guests pretended not to stare, but Naomi could feel their eyes moving across her hoodie, her tired face, and the worn edges of her nursing shoes. A woman near the perfume counter slowly lowered her champagne glass without taking her eyes off Naomi. Another guest whispered something into his wife's ear before both of them smirked quietly. Naomi swallowed hard and forced herself to breathe evenly. "Yes," she answered softly. "I can." Richard tilted his head slightly, almost amused by her response. "That is interesting," he said, "because tonight is a private event for preferred clients." Naomi glanced toward the glass entrance doors behind her where snow continued falling outside beneath the yellow Chicago streetlights. No sign anywhere had mentioned a private event. She had checked twice before walking in because places like this already made her nervous enough. "The doors were open," she replied carefully. "I only came to buy one thing." Richard's eyes drifted down toward her tote bag. "I see." The young security guard standing beside him shifted uncomfortably. He could not have been older than 23. His badge read Ethan. Naomi noticed the way he avoided eye contact, as if even he knew something about this moment felt wrong. Richard gave a small smile that never reached his eyes. People usually come in during events like this for reasons other than shopping. Naomi felt heat rise slowly into her face. Her fingers tightened around the cashmere gloves until the fabric wrinkled slightly between her hands. She wanted to leave. Every instinct inside her told her to put the gloves down and walk back into the freezing night where nobody could stare at her anymore. But then she remembered her mother sitting beside the apartment window 3 nights earlier with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, rubbing her hands together because the cold had started hurting her joints again after chemotherapy. "Do not spend money on me," her mother had whispered with a tired smile. "I already have enough." Naomi remembered pretending to laugh while secretly checking her bank account under the kitchen table. After rent, utilities, and hospital parking fees, she barely had enough left. But she had picked up 3 extra overnight shifts anyway because her mother had once worked 2 jobs for nearly 10 years to keep food on their table after Naomi's father passed away. So no, Naomi was not leaving empty-handed tonight. Richard extended his hand suddenly. "May I see what is inside your bag?" The words landed softly, but the silence around them became immediate and sharp. Naomi blinked. "My bag. Store policy," Richard replied. "Random security check." Ethan looked down at the marble floor the moment Richard said it. Naomi noticed that none of the wealthy guests around her were being stopped. A white woman walked past carrying 2 large shopping bags without so much as a glance from security. Naomi felt something heavy settle quietly in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the familiar exhaustion of realizing exactly what kind of moment this was becoming. She slowly lifted her eyes toward Richard again. "Are you checking everyone's bags tonight?" she asked quietly. "Or just mine?" The question hung in the air so heavily that even the music seemed to disappear beneath it. Naomi stood motionless beside the cashmere display while snow swirled outside the tall glass windows behind her, the white flakes catching the yellow glow of the Chicago streetlights like drifting ash. Richard Holloway looked at her without blinking. Around them, expensive shoes tapped softly against marble floors as wealthy guests slowed their conversations just enough to listen without appearing obvious. Naomi could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace display near the fragrance section and the distant clink of champagne glasses somewhere behind her, but nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. Richard gave a short smile that carried no warmth at all. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "there is no need to make this difficult." Naomi felt her pulse beating hard against the side of her neck. She had spent years learning how to stay calm under pressure. Inside emergency rooms, she had watched families cry beside hospital beds at 3 in the morning while monitors beeped steadily in dark corners and doctors rushed through automatic doors with exhausted eyes. She knew how fear sounded. She knew how humiliation felt too. But there was something especially painful about this moment, because she could already see how everyone around her had silently accepted Richard's version of reality before she had even spoken. To them, she was not a tired nurse buying winter gloves for her mother. She was simply the black woman in a faded hoodie standing under bright luxury lights where she supposedly did not belong. Ethan shifted beside Richard again, clearly uneasy. "Sir," he said quietly, "maybe we could just let her pay and go." Richard's expression hardened almost instantly. "I did not ask for your opinion." The young guard immediately fell silent. Naomi looked down briefly at the gloves in her hands. The soft brown fabric reminded her of the blanket her mother used to wrap around herself during chemo treatments. Even now she could picture her sitting near the apartment radiator with tired eyes and dry hands trembling slightly as she held a mug of tea. Naomi had promised herself she would not cry tonight, no matter how exhausted she felt. She had already cried enough alone in hospital supply closets after double shifts and unpaid bills and nights when sleep felt impossible. So instead of lowering her head, she slowly lifted her chin and met Richard's eyes directly. "You still did not answer my question," she said quietly. Richard folded his arms. "Excuse me. Are you checking everyone's bags?" Naomi repeated softly. "Or only mine?" Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman wearing a white fur coat suddenly focused very hard on her phone screen. A man near the wine table cleared his throat awkwardly before stepping farther away from the scene. Richard noticed it too. The room was shifting slightly, and he did not like losing control of attention. His smile returned, thinner this time. "You are taking this personally," he said. "Store security procedures apply to everyone." Naomi looked slowly around the room. A teenage employee near the jewelry counter froze when her eyes met his, because both of them knew that statement was not true. Naomi inhaled carefully through her nose, trying to steady herself against the rising heat in her chest. Her feet hurt. Her back ached from lifting patients all night. She had not eaten since 4 that morning except for stale crackers from a hospital vending machine. And still, somehow, she remained the calmest person in the room. Richard stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Now," he said firmly, extending his hand toward her bag once more. "Unless you have something to hide, I suggest you cooperate." Naomi stared at his hand for a long second. Then, very slowly, she reached into the pocket of her hoodie. Several guests leaned forward instinctively, watching her every movement beneath the cold white store lights. But instead of opening her bag, Naomi pulled out her phone, unlocked the screen, and pressed one small red button. The small red light appeared on Naomi's phone screen, and suddenly the entire atmosphere inside the department store changed. Richard Holloway noticed it immediately. "Are you recording?" he asked sharply. Naomi held the phone steady in one hand, while the other still clutched the pair of brown cashmere gloves against her chest. "Yes," she answered quietly. "For my safety." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Several nearby guests looked away at once, uncomfortable now that the moment no longer felt like private entertainment. Naomi could hear the soft clicking of high heels moving farther down the marble walkway as people created distance between themselves and the confrontation without actually leaving. Snow continued sliding down the giant front windows in slow white streaks, while warm air drifted through the ceiling vents overhead. But Naomi still felt cold all the way into her bones. Richard forced another smile, though this one looked thinner and tighter than before. "You are making a scene," he said. Naomi stared at him for a moment, almost surprised by the sentence. "I was shopping," she replied softly. "You stopped me." Ethan lowered his eyes again. The young guard looked trapped between embarrassment and fear of losing his job. Naomi understood that look. She had seen it on exhausted interns at the hospital when senior doctors blamed them publicly for mistakes they did not make. Power always sounded calm when it thought nobody would challenge it. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Ma'am, if you cooperate, this will be over quickly." Naomi adjusted the phone carefully so the camera captured both his face and hers. "Can you explain why I was selected for a bag check?" she asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "Random procedure." Naomi slowly turned the camera toward the crowded store behind them. Expensive coats. Jewelry counters glowing under white lights. Servers carrying silver trays of champagne. Not one other customer being stopped. When she pointed the phone back toward Richard, his expression darkened for only a fraction of a second before smoothing itself out again. "I am asking one final time," he said firmly. "Open your bag." Naomi could feel dozens of people watching her hands. Her heart pounded so loudly she almost could not hear the violin music anymore. But beneath the fear, another feeling had started growing slowly inside her. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion from overnight hospital shifts or unpaid overtime. A deeper kind. The exhaustion of constantly needing to prove she belonged in places where others were automatically welcomed. She thought about all the times she had entered elevators and watched strangers grip their purses tighter. The times patients assumed she was cleaning staff instead of a registered nurse. The times people complimented her for speaking so well. Tiny cuts. Tiny humiliations. One after another for years. Naomi inhaled carefully and placed the cashmere gloves back onto the display table with shaking fingers. Then, still live streaming, she slowly opened her tote bag. Inside were neatly folded hospital scrubs, a half-empty water bottle, crackers from the hospital vending machine, and a worn paperback Bible with highlighted pages sticking out from the edges. The silence around her deepened immediately. Richard looked disappointed for half a second before hiding it behind another cold professional expression. "Empty the side pocket too," he said. Ethan looked up quickly. "Sir, there is clearly nothing there." Richard ignored him completely. Naomi felt humiliation burn through her chest as nearby guests stared openly now, some pretending concern, while others watched with the detached curiosity, people reserved for uncomfortable public drama. Her fingers trembled again as she unzipped the smaller pocket. A bottle of ibuprofen slid gently into her palm beside a folded pharmacy receipt and a handwritten note from her mother that read, "Do not forget your scarf tonight, baby. It is freezing outside." Naomi swallowed hard when she saw the handwriting. For one dangerous second, emotion nearly cracked through her calm expression. Then from somewhere near the wine display, a man's voice suddenly broke the silence. "Wait a second," he said slowly. "I know her." The words cut through the silence so suddenly that even Richard Holloway turned his head. Near the wine display stood an older white man in a charcoal suit with silver hair and tired eyes. He had been quiet the entire evening, holding a glass of untouched champagne while watching the scene from a distance nobody had noticed before. Now he stared directly at Naomi as if trying to place a memory that had just slammed into him without warning. "I know her," he repeated slowly. Naomi blinked in confusion, still gripping her phone in one trembling hand. The man stepped forward through the crowd, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. Several guests moved aside immediately, recognizing him. Richard's expression changed almost instantly. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quickly, forcing warmth back into his voice. "Good evening. I apologize for this unfortunate interruption." But the older man ignored him completely. His eyes never left Naomi's face. "You were at St. Vincent last month," he said quietly. "Cardiac intensive care unit." Naomi felt her breath catch slightly. The hospital lights flashed through her memory for a second. Long hallways, sleepless nights, machines beeping in dark rooms while snow fell outside the windows. Then she remembered him sitting beside an older patient holding a paper coffee cup with both hands because they would not stop shaking. "Your father," Naomi said softly before she could stop herself. The man nodded once. Emotion tightened his face almost immediately. 3 nights in intensive care, he whispered. Nobody could calm him down except you. The department store fell completely silent now. Even the employees had stopped pretending to work. Naomi lowered her phone slightly, stunned by the sudden shift in the room. Mr. Whitmore looked at Richard with visible disbelief. "This woman stayed beside my father during one of the worst nights of our lives," he said. She held his hand when he thought he was dying. Richard opened his mouth carefully. "Sir, I am sure there has been a misunderstanding." "No," Mr. Whitmore interrupted sharply. "I think I understand exactly what this is." Naomi felt heat rising behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. The memory returned more clearly now. Mr. Whitmore's father had been terrified after emergency heart surgery complications. Around 2 in the morning, he had started crying quietly because he believed he would never leave the hospital alive. Naomi had sat beside him during her break, adjusting his blanket and speaking gently until his breathing slowed. She had not even known the family was wealthy. At the hospital, fear looked the same on everybody. Richard glanced around nervously as several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. A woman near the jewelry counter quietly lowered her phone after realizing she had been recording part of the incident. Ethan looked like he wanted the floor beneath him to open. Mr. Whitmore stepped closer to Naomi. "My father asks about you constantly," he said softly. He said the nurse with the warm voice treated him like he still mattered. Naomi swallowed hard. Nobody in the room spoke. Richard's polished confidence had started cracking at the edges now. He straightened his jacket and tried one last time to regain control. "Sir, we were simply following standard store security policy." Mr. Whitmore slowly turned toward him. "Then why was she the only customer searched tonight?" Richard froze. The question landed like cold iron in the center of the room. Nobody answered because nobody could. Snow continued sliding down the giant front windows while the chandelier light reflected against the marble floors in pale gold patterns. Naomi suddenly became aware of how exhausted she truly felt. Her shoulders hurt. Her feet burned. Her stomach was empty except for vending machine crackers from hours ago. And yet somehow she was still standing there with more dignity than everyone who had tried to humiliate her. Mr. Whitmore looked back toward Naomi again, his voice quieter this time. "Do you know who I am?" Naomi shook her head slowly. The older man glanced once at Richard before answering. "My family owns 30% of this company." For several long seconds, Nobody inside the department store moved. The words seemed to settle over the marble floor like heavy winter snow. My family owns 30% of this company. Richard Holloway's face lost color almost immediately beneath the chandelier light. Naomi could actually hear the manager swallow. Somewhere near the fragrance counter, a champagne glass touched down softly against a silver tray with a tiny ringing sound that echoed strangely through the silence. Ethan stared at the floor as if afraid to look at anyone. Naomi remained standing beside the cashmere display with her phone still live-streaming quietly in her hand, though she had nearly forgotten about it now. Her heart continued pounding from exhaustion and humiliation, but another feeling had slowly begun replacing the fear inside her chest. Not victory, not satisfaction, just disbelief at how quickly people changed once power entered the room. A few minutes earlier, those same guests had watched her like she was dangerous. Now many of them would not even meet her eyes. Mr. Whitmore looked toward the open tote bag still resting on the display table beside Naomi. Hospital scrubs folded neatly. Crushed vending machine crackers. A Bible worn soft at the corners from years of use. The handwritten note from her mother. Such ordinary things. Such human things. Yet somehow those simple items had become evidence in a trial Naomi never agreed to stand in. Richard straightened his jacket again, trying desperately to regain the polished composure that had made him successful in rooms like this for years. Mr. Whitmore, he said carefully, if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, I assure you we can resolve it privately. The older man turned slowly toward him. Privately, he repeated. You humiliated her publicly. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out this time. Snow continued falling heavily outside the giant windows, covering the sidewalks in white, while warm golden light filled the store interior with artificial comfort. Naomi suddenly felt very tired. More tired than she had felt all week. Her knees ached beneath her scrubs. The muscles in her shoulders burned from lifting patients during overnight shifts. Even holding the phone steady had become difficult. She slowly lowered it to her side. The live stream was still running. Tens of thousands of viewers were watching now, though Naomi had no idea. Comments moved too fast across the screen for her to read. Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, he said quietly to Naomi, I am sorry. Richard shot him a sharp look immediately, but the young guard did not take the apology back. Naomi looked at Ethan for a second and saw genuine shame in his face. Not the polished corporate regret Richard kept performing. Real shame. Human shame. And somehow that hurt more than the confrontation itself, because it reminded her that people always knew when something was wrong. They just stayed silent until silence became uncomfortable. Mr. Whitmore glanced around the room slowly. My father was terrified in that hospital, he said. He could barely breathe. Every machine around him kept making sounds I did not understand. His voice grew quieter. This woman sat beside him at 3 in the morning and treated him with kindness when nobody else even had time to stop walking. Naomi felt her eyes burn again. She remembered that night clearly now. The old man had squeezed her hand before falling asleep because he was afraid he would not wake up again. At the time, Naomi had simply done what nurses do every day. She had never expected anyone to remember. Richard's voice sounded smaller now. Sir, I was only protecting the store. Mr. Whitmore looked at him with visible disappointment. No, he replied softly. You were protecting your assumptions. The room fell silent once more. Naomi looked down at the pair of brown cashmere gloves still sitting on the display table beneath the bright white lights. They suddenly seemed so small compared to everything this night had become. All she had wanted was something warm for her mother's hands. Richard Holloway looked like a man trying to hold together a room that had already started collapsing around him. The polished confidence that once made him seem untouchable now felt thin beneath the bright department store lights. Guests who had laughed quietly earlier were suddenly avoiding his eyes. Employees stood frozen behind display counters pretending to organize merchandise while secretly listening to every word. Outside, heavy snow covered the Chicago sidewalks in thick white layers, muting the sounds of traffic beyond the glass windows. Inside, the warm air smelled faintly of perfume, leather handbags, and fresh pine from the holiday decorations hanging above the escalators. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the cashmere gloves, exhausted but steady, while her live stream continued silently in her hand. She had almost forgotten the phone was still recording until it vibrated softly with endless incoming notifications. Thousands of strangers were now watching the same humiliation she had just survived in person. Mr. Whitmore slowly removed his glasses and rubbed a hand across his face as if disappointment physically hurt. "Do you understand what you did tonight?" he asked Richard quietly. Richard tried to answer carefully. "Sir, my responsibility is protecting the customer experience." Mr. Whitmore stared at him in disbelief. Customer experience? His voice remained calm, but the disappointment inside it spread across the room more heavily than shouting ever could. "That woman spent her night caring for dying people while you stood here deciding who looked expensive enough to deserve respect." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second. She did not know why those words hurt more than the accusation itself. Maybe because nobody had defended her like that in a very long time. Ethan suddenly stepped forward before fear could stop him. "Sir," he said quietly toward Mr. Whitmore, "she never caused any problem. Mr. Holloway told me to watch her the moment she walked in." Richard turned sharply toward the young guard. "Ethan." The warning inside his voice was immediate. But Ethan looked pale and determined now. "You said she did not belong here," he continued softly. "You said people like her make the guests uncomfortable." The room became completely still. Naomi felt something tighten painfully in her chest as the truth finally entered the open air where nobody could hide from it anymore. Richard's face hardened. "That is not what I meant." But nobody believed him now. Not after the live stream. Not after the search. Not after the silence that followed every chance he had to treat Naomi like a human being instead of a threat. Mr. Whitmore looked toward Naomi again, his expression gentler now. "How long were you working before you came here tonight?" Naomi hesitated. 14 hours. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks immediately. Naomi could see shame spreading quietly across faces that earlier held amusement. A woman near the jewelry section slowly wiped beneath one eye with her fingertip before pretending she had dust in it. Naomi hated that part most of all. The sudden sympathy. The way people only softened after they discovered she was useful to someone important. Mr. Whitmore noticed it too. "You should not have needed me standing here for people to treat you with dignity," he said quietly. Naomi finally looked directly at him. Her voice came out softer than she expected. "I did not want special treatment." Snow drifted sideways against the windows behind them, while the chandelier lights reflected across the polished marble floors like pale gold water. Naomi's body felt heavy with exhaustion now. Her feet burned inside her nursing shoes. Her head throbbed from lack of sleep. Yet despite everything, she still stood calmly while the people who humiliated her looked smaller by the second. Richard opened his mouth again, searching desperately for control. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." But before anyone could answer, a woman near the front entrance suddenly lifted her phone and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Too late." The video already hit 6 million views. The moment the woman announced the video had reached 6 million views, the atmosphere inside the department store shifted completely. It no longer felt like a luxury shopping event. It felt like a room full of people suddenly realizing the world was watching them without filters or excuses. Naomi stood quietly beside the display table while phones continued, lighting up across the store like tiny alarms. Employees glanced nervously at their screens. Guests whispered under their breath. Somewhere near the entrance, a cashier actually gasped after reading the comments flooding social media in real time. Richard Holloway looked frozen beneath the chandelier lights, his carefully controlled image collapsing faster than he could repair it. Naomi noticed his hands for the first time that night. They were trembling slightly. Mr. Whitmore slowly slipped his glasses back on and looked toward the front entrance as two people in dark winter coats hurried into the store carrying leather portfolios and company badges clipped to their jackets. Corporate executives. Richard saw them too. The color drained from his face almost immediately. One of the executives, a tall woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, walked straight across the marble floor without acknowledging anyone else in the room. Her heels clicked sharply with every step until she stopped directly in front of Richard. "We need to speak now," she said quietly. Richard attempted a weak, professional smile. "Karen, I can explain." "No," she interrupted calmly. "You can start by removing your badge." The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, overwhelmed not by satisfaction, but by exhaustion. The entire night suddenly weighed on her shoulders all at once. She could still feel the humiliation from earlier sitting heavily inside her chest like cold stone. The comments, the stares, the suspicion in people's eyes before anyone knew she mattered to someone important. Ethan stepped back quietly while Richard slowly unclipped his manager badge with stiff fingers. The silver metal reflected beneath the chandelier light before disappearing into Karen's hand. Several guests watched openly now, no longer pretending discretion. Naomi hated how quickly public shame changed direction. One moment it belonged to her. Now it belonged to him. Richard looked toward Naomi suddenly, and for the first time that night, his voice sounded uncertain. "Human. Miss Carter," he said softly. "I apologize if my actions offended you." Naomi stared at him, in silence for a moment. The apology sounded polished, practiced, carefully constructed to survive legal review. But it carried no real understanding inside it. She had heard that tone before from hospital administrators after discrimination complaints quietly disappeared into paperwork. Mr. Whitmore looked disappointed again. He repeated quietly toward Richard. Richard lowered his eyes. Snow continued falling heavily outside, while warm air moved softly through the vents overhead. The violin music had stopped entirely now, leaving only the low hum of heating systems and distant traffic muffled beyond the glass. Naomi suddenly became aware of how badly her feet hurt. She had been standing for nearly 20 minutes without moving after 14 hours at the hospital. Karen turned gently toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "on behalf of the company, I am deeply sorry for what happened tonight." Naomi nodded once, too tired to answer immediately. Karen glanced toward the livestream, still running on Naomi's phone. "We will conduct a full investigation." Naomi looked down at the cashmere gloves resting quietly on the display table. After everything that had happened, they somehow still looked simple and small beneath the bright luxury lights. "I did not come here to destroy anybody's career," she said softly. Her voice barely rose above the quiet hum of the building. "I just wanted to buy gloves for my mother." Nobody spoke after that, because in the end, that was the part that hurt the most. Not the livestream, not the public embarrassment, just the realization that kindness had walked into the store exhausted from saving lives and still got treated like a threat before it was treated like a person. Karen looked visibly shaken by the sentence. Even Richard lowered his head. Naomi slowly reached for the gloves again, preparing at last to leave. Naomi held the pair of brown cashmere gloves carefully against her chest while the department store remained frozen in uneasy silence around her. Nobody tried to stop her anymore. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. The same marble floor that had felt cold and hostile less than an hour earlier now seemed strangely hollow beneath the chandelier light, as if the building itself had become embarrassed by what had happened inside it. Karen stepped aside quietly to clear a path toward the front entrance while employees lowered their eyes one after another. Ethan gave Naomi a small nod filled with apology she could tell was genuine. She returned the nod softly before walking toward the register at the front of the store. Her legs felt heavy with exhaustion, but she kept her shoulders straight. The cashier waiting there looked barely old enough to graduate college. Her hands trembled slightly while scanning the gloves. "Ma'am," she whispered carefully, "your purchase has already been covered." Naomi looked up in confusion. Mr. Whitmore stood several feet away near the fragrance display, adjusting his winter coat. "Please," he said gently. "Allow me." Naomi hesitated for a moment. Then she reached into her tote bag and removed 3 folded $20 bills along with a handful of smaller cash she had spent weeks saving from overtime shifts. "No," she said softly. "I would still like to pay for them myself." The cashier looked uncertainly toward Karen, who simply nodded once. Naomi placed the money carefully onto the counter beneath the warm yellow register lights. Her fingers shook slightly from fatigue as she counted every dollar. The room remained silent while she did it. Somehow that quiet respect meant more to her than any apologies spoken all night. When the receipt finally printed, the soft mechanical sound echoed gently through the stillness. Naomi folded it carefully and placed it inside her pocket beside her mother's handwritten note. Then she picked up the small black shopping bag containing the gloves. It was surprisingly light in her hand after carrying the emotional weight of the entire evening. Richard Holloway still stood near the center of the store surrounded by corporate executives, his manager badge gone now, his expression pale and distant. For a brief second their eyes met across the marble floor. Naomi expected anger or shame. Instead, she saw something emptier. A man realizing too late that power had made him stop seeing people clearly. Naomi did not hate him. She was too tired to hate anyone. She simply hoped one day he would understand that dignity should never depend on who is watching. Without another word, she turned toward the exit. The automatic glass doors opened slowly with a soft mechanical whisper, and cold winter air rushed gently against her face. Snowflakes drifted down beneath the glowing Chicago streetlights, covering the sidewalks in fresh white silence. Naomi stepped outside at last. The cold air smelled cleaner than the expensive perfume inside the store. Behind her, voices remained low and distant, fading away as the doors slowly closed. She pulled her hoodie tighter around herself and stood still for one quiet moment beneath the falling snow. Her phone vibrated endlessly with notifications inside her pocket, but she ignored them. Viral videos faded. Public outrage faded. But her mother would still be waiting at home beside the apartment window with cold hands and tired eyes. Naomi looked down at the small shopping bag hanging from her fingers. Then she smiled softly to herself for the first time that night. Across the street, headlights reflected against the snow-covered pavement while steam rose slowly from a subway grate into the freezing air. Naomi adjusted the strap of her worn tote bag on her shoulder and began walking toward the bus stop beneath the pale glow of the city lights. No cameras followed her now. No voices judged her. Only the soft sound of snow falling around her while she disappeared quietly into the winter night, carrying warmth home in her hands.